The grand ballroom of Kensington Palace had never felt so heavy with silence. Crown Prince Alexander stood at the center of the ornate room, his usually confident shoulders now trembling slightly as he held a single white envelope in his hands. The golden chandeliers cast their warm light across the faces of nearly 200 guests, all dressed in their finest evening wear for what was supposed to be a celebration of the Royal Charity Foundation. Princess Elena stood beside him, her emerald green gown catching the light as she reached out to touch his arm gently. She had seen that look in his eyes before, the same expression he wore when difficult news arrived at the palace. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of whatever was in that envelope seemed to press down on everyone in the room. The evening had started like any other royal gala. Guests mingled with champagne glasses, discussing the success of the children's hospital project that the royal couple had championed for 3 years. Laughter echoed through the halls as dignitaries, celebrities, and charity workers celebrated the millions of pounds raised for sick children across the kingdom. Alexander and Elena had worked tirelessly on this project, visiting hospitals, meeting families, and using their platform to bring hope to those who needed it most. But then, just as Alexander was about to give his speech, his private secretary that had approached him with urgent steps. The man's face was pale, and he whispered something that made the prince's expression change completely. Alexander had excused himself briefly, disappearing into a small side room with Elena following close behind. When they returned, Alexander carried the envelope, and Elena's eyes were already glistening with unshed tears. The guests sensed something had shifted. Conversations died down naturally as people noticed the change in the royal couple's demeanor. The orchestra, which had been playing soft background music, gradually faded to silence. Alexander looked around the room at all the faces watching him expectantly. These were people who had given their time, money, and hearts to help children they had never met. Some were wealthy donors who had written large checks. Others were volunteers who had spent countless hours organizing events. There were doctors and nurses who had worked with the Royal Foundation, and even some of the older children from the hospitals who had been well enough to attend the celebration. Elena moved closer to her husband, and for a moment she whispered something in his ear. Alexander nodded slowly, then looked down at the envelope again. His hands, usually so steady during public appearances, shook slightly as he opened it. The room was so quiet that people could hear the rustle of paper as Alexander unfolded the letter inside. He read it silently, his eyes moving across the lines of text. As he read, his jaw tightened, and those closest to the front could see his eyes beginning to fill with tears. Princess Elena, always composed in public, felt her own emotions rising as she watched her husband struggle with whatever news the letter contained. She had learned over their years together to read his expressions perfectly. This was not just disappointment or frustration. This was heartbreak. Alexander cleared his throat and looked up at the gathered crowd. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than usual, lacking its typical confident resonance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, then stopped. He looked down at the letter again, then back at the crowd. "I'm afraid I have received some news that I must share with you all." The silence in the room deepened. Even the staff members who had been quietly moving around the edges of the room stopped what they were doing to listen. Alexander took a deep breath, and Elena moved even closer to him, her hand now resting on his back in a gesture of support that everyone could see. "As you all know," Alexander continued, "our foundation has been working with St. Mary's Children's Hospital to build a new wing for children with serious illnesses. We have raised enough money, we have the plans approved, and construction was supposed to begin next month." He paused again, and several people in the crowd exchanged worried glances. The St. Mary's project had been the centerpiece of their fundraising efforts for over a year. "I have just received word," Alexander said, his voice beginning to crack, "that St. Mary's Hospital has lost its license to operate. There have been serious management problems, financial irregularities, and safety concerns that the health authorities discovered during a surprise inspection last week." A collective gasp went through the room. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of what this meant. Alexander continued, "The hospital will be closed permanently within 30 days. All the children currently receiving treatment there will need to be transferred to other facilities. And our new wing, the project we have all worked so hard to fund, cannot be built." The news hit the room like a physical blow. People who had donated thousands of pounds looked stunned. The volunteers who had organized countless events to raise money appeared confused and heartbroken. But most devastating of all were the faces of the children and families in attendance, those who had been counting on the new wing for their ongoing treatment. Alexander looked directly at a young girl named Sophie, who was sitting in a wheelchair in the front row. She was 8 years old and had been fighting leukemia for 2 years. Her parents had brought her to the gala because she had been so excited to see the prince and princess, and because the new wing at St. Mary's was supposed to be where she would receive her next round of treatment. When Alexander's eyes met Sophie's, something inside him broke. This little girl, who had already endured so much pain and uncertainty, was now facing the stress of finding new doctors and a new hospital. All the progress they had made, all the hope they had built, seemed to crumble in that moment. Alina watched as her husband's composure finally gave way. A single tear rolled down Alexander's cheek, and he made no attempt to hide it. In that moment, he was not a prince or a future king. He was simply a man who had failed to protect the children he had promised to help. The silence in the room was complete now, broken only by the sound of Sophie's mother quietly crying in the front row. The tear that had escaped down Prince Alexander's cheek seemed to give permission for the entire room to feel the weight of the moment. Princess Alina, seeing her husband's pain so openly displayed, felt her own carefully maintained composure begin to crack. She had spent years learning how to smile through difficult moments, how to remain graceful under pressure. But watching Alexander struggle with this devastating news broke something inside her. Sophie's mother in the front row was no longer trying to hide her tears. The woman had placed so much hope in the new wing at St. Mary's Hospital. For months, she had told her daughter about the beautiful new rooms where she would receive treatment, about how Prince Alexander and Princess Elena were making sure everything would be perfect for children like her. Now that hope was gone, and she didn't know how to explain this to her 8-year-old daughter who was already fighting so hard just to survive. Alexander wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, a gesture so human and unguarded that it sent ripples of emotion through the crowd. Royal protocol had never prepared him for a moment like this. All his training had focused on maintaining dignity, on being strong for his people. But how could he be strong when children were suffering because of circumstances beyond anyone's control? Alina stepped forward slightly, positioning herself so she could see both her husband and the crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "We know this news is heartbreaking for everyone here," she said, her own voice wavering slightly, especially for the families who were counting on St. Mary's for their children's care. As she spoke, Elena's eyes found other families in the crowd. There was 10-year-old Marcus, who had been born with a serious heart condition and needed regular monitoring. His parents had driven 3 hours to attend the gala because they were so grateful for the royal couple's support. There was also 7-year-old Emma, who was recovering from brain surgery and whose family had been told the new wing would have specialized equipment perfect for her ongoing treatment. The reality of what the hospital closure meant was beginning to sink in. For everyone, it wasn't just about the money they had raised or the plans they had made. Real children with real medical needs were now facing uncertainty about where they would receive care. Some families might have to travel hundreds of miles to find appropriate treatment. Others might face long waiting lists at hospitals that were already overcrowded. Alexander looked down at the letter again, reading the clinical language that described the hospital's failures, financial mismanagement, inadequate safety protocols, staff shortages that had been hidden from inspectors. The administrators had been more concerned with their own profits than with the children they were supposed to help. It made him angry, but the anger was mixed with such deep sadness that he felt overwhelmed. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been working with the Royal Foundation for 2 years, stood up from her seat in the third row. She was a pediatric oncologist who had been planning to work in the new wing, and she understood better than most what this news meant for her young patients. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "I want you to know that what has happened at St. Mary's is not your fault. You have given these children and families hope and support when they needed it most. That doesn't disappear because of the hospital's problems." Her words seemed to give Alexander a moment of strength. He straightened his shoulders slightly and looked around the room again. But as his eyes moved from face to face, he saw the disappointment and fear in the expressions of parents whose children needed medical care. Elena reached over and took Alexander's free hand in hers. The gesture was small, but everyone in the room could see it. In that moment, they weren't just a prince and princess performing their royal duties. They were a couple sharing a moment of genuine grief over children they had come to care about deeply. 3 years ago, Alexander said, his voice stronger now but still heavy with emotion, "Alina and I visited St. Mary's Hospital for the first time. We met children who were facing the biggest fight of their lives, and we met parents who were doing everything they could to help their sons and daughters get better." He paused, remembering that first visit. Sophie had been there, much smaller then, clutching a stuffed rabbit while receiving chemotherapy. Marcus had been recovering from his second heart surgery. Emma hadn't even been diagnosed yet with a tumor that would require such extensive treatment. "We made a promise that day," Alexander continued. "We promised that we would do everything in our power to make sure these children had the best possible care in the most beautiful, comfortable, the environment we could create." Alina squeezed his hand tighter, remembering that day as well. They had both been moved by the strength of the children and the dedication of their families. That visit had changed something in both of them, making them more determined to use their position to help people who truly needed it. "Today I feel like we have broken that promise," Alexander said, and his voice cracked again. "Not because we didn't try hard enough or because we didn't care enough, but because sometimes terrible things happen that are beyond our control." The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't the shocked silence of people hearing bad news. It was the quiet of people sharing a moment of deep sadness together. Even the adults who didn't have children of their own found themselves thinking about Sophie and Marcus and Emma, and all the other young patients whose lives had just become more complicated. Princess Alina looked at her husband with such love and admiration that several people in the crowd felt their own eyes filled with tears. She had always known that Alexander cared deeply about their charitable work, but seeing him so emotionally affected by the children's situation made her fall in love with him all over again. Young Sophie, sitting in her wheelchair in the front row, raised her small hand. The movement caught Alexander's attention, and he looked down at her with surprise. Royal protocol didn't usually include taking questions from the audience during speeches, but this wasn't a usual situation. "Yes, Sophie," Alexander said, his voice gentle. "Prince Alexander," Sophie said in her clear, brave voice. "My mummy says that sometimes bad things happen, but good people find ways to make them better. Are you and Princess Elena going to find a way to make this better?" The question hung in the air like a challenge and a plea combined. Everyone in the room waited to hear how the royal couple would respond to the simple, direct question from a child who had already shown more courage than most adults would ever need to display. Sophie's question echoed through the grand ballroom like a bell calling everyone to attention. Her small voice carried such hope and trust that it seemed to lift some of the heavy sadness that had settled over the room. Prince Alexander looked down at the brave little girl in her wheelchair, her bald head covered by a colorful knitted hat that her grandmother had made for her, and felt something shift inside his chest. Princess Elena also turned to look at Sophie, and in that moment, both of them remembered why they had started this work in the first place. It wasn't about the buildings or the money or even the recognition. It was about children like Sophie who faced each day with more courage than most people could imagine. Alexander knelt down so he could be at Sophie's eye level. The formal evening jacket of his tuxedo stretched slightly as he moved, but he didn't care about protocol or proper royal behavior. He only cared about answering this child's question with the honesty she deserved. "Sophie," he said, his voice steady now for the first time since receiving the letter, "that is exactly what Princess Elena and I are going to do. We are going to find a way to make this better." Elena felt her heart swell with pride as she watched her husband make this promise. She knew that he meant every word, and she also knew that they would have to figure out how to keep that promise even though they had no clear plan yet. Sophie smiled. The first real smile anyone in the room had seen since the devastating news was shared. Her mother reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, tears still flowing down her cheeks but now mixed with something that looked like hope. Alexander stood back up and turned to address the entire room again. The interaction with Sophie had given him clarity about what needed to happen next. "Everyone in this room came here tonight because you believe in helping children who need medical care," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Belief doesn't disappear because one hospital has failed. If anything, it means we need to work harder and be smarter about how we help." Alina stepped forward to stand beside her husband again. She had been thinking quickly while Alexander spoke with Sophie, and she had the beginnings of an idea forming in her mind. "St. Mary's Hospital may be closing," Alina said, "but there are other hospitals that treat children with serious illnesses, hospitals that are run properly and safely, hospitals that could use our support to expand their services and help more children." Dr. Williams stood up again from her seat in the third row. As a pediatric oncologist, she knew better than anyone which hospitals had good reputations and which ones needed additional resources to serve more patients. "Your Royal Highnesses," Dr. Williams said, "if I may suggest something. There are 3 children's hospitals within 50 miles of here that have excellent medical staff and proper management, but they are all operating at full capacity. They have waiting lists for treatment because they don't have enough space or equipment to help every child who needs care." Alexander nodded, encouraging her to continue. He could see where this conversation was heading, and it was giving him the first sense of hope he had felt since opening that terrible letter. Instead of building one new wing at one hospital, Dr. Williams continued, the money that has been raised could be used to expand services at multiple hospitals. It might actually help more children than the original plan would have. Alina felt excitement building inside her as she listened to Dr. Williams speak. This could work. It might even be better than their original plan because it would spread the help across a wider area and serve more families. Alexander looked around the room at all the faces watching him. If we could see that people were beginning to understand that this devastating news might not be the end of their efforts to help children, it might actually be the beginning of something bigger and better. Marcus's father, a quiet man who rarely spoke at public events, raised his hand tentatively. Alexander nodded for him to speak. "Prince Alexander," the man said, "my son Marcus has been treated at 3 different hospitals over the past 5 years. Some of them have wonderful doctors but old equipment, others have new equipment but not enough doctors. We could help several hospitals improve what they already have. It might make a bigger difference than building something completely new." Alina smiled at Marcus's father, grateful for his practical perspective. She could see that other parents in the room were nodding in agreement. These families had experience with the healthcare system that she and Alexander could learn from. Emma's mother also stood up to speak. She was a nurse herself, so she understood how hospitals operated from the inside. The biggest problem most children's hospitals face, she said, is not having enough of everything they need. Not enough beds, not enough specialized equipment, not enough support staff. If the money could be divided among several hospitals, each one could get what it needs most. Alexander felt a surge of admiration for these parents who were thinking so clearly about solutions even while dealing with their own fears and disappointments. They were showing him and Alina how to turn this crisis into an opportunity. "You are all absolutely right," Alexander said. "Instead of putting all our efforts into one project at one hospital, we can create a network of support that helps children across a much wider area." Alina was already thinking about the practical details of how this could work. They would need to visit other hospitals, assess their needs, and work with medical professionals to determine how the funds could be used most effectively. "We will need to research which hospitals would benefit most from additional support," Alina said. "We will need to visit them, talk to their staff, and understand what each one needs to serve more children better." Sophie raised her small hand again, and both Alexander and Alina immediately turned their attention to her. "Will this mean that children like me can get help even if we live far away from the big hospitals?" Sophie asked. Alexander knelt down again to answer her question. "Directly, yes, Sophie. That is exactly what this means. Children who live in smaller towns or rural areas will have better access to the care they need because we will be helping hospitals in different locations." The mood in the room had transformed completely. What had started as an evening of devastating disappointment was becoming a planning session for an even more ambitious project. People were no longer crying tears of sadness. Some were crying tears of excitement about the possibilities they were discovering. Alina looked around the room at all the people who had come together to support sick children: wealthy donors, medical professionals, volunteer fundraisers, and, most importantly, the families whose children needed help. They were all still there, still committed to the cause, still ready to work together despite the setback with St. Mary's Hospital. "This will require more work than our original plan," Alexander said honestly. "Coordinating support for multiple hospitals will be more complicated than building one new wing, but if we do it right, we can help many more children and families." The room erupted in the first applause of the evening, and it was louder and more enthusiastic than any polite applause at a typical royal gala. These people were applauding not just the royal couple, but their own collective decision to turn a crisis into an opportunity to do even more good than they had originally planned. The applause that filled the ballroom seemed to energize everyone in the room. But Prince Alexander knew that turning their new plan into reality would require immediate action. He looked at Princess Elena and she gave him a small nod that told him she was thinking the same thing. They couldn't let this moment of hope and determination fade away without concrete steps forward. Alexander raised his hand to quiet the applause, and the room gradually returned to focused attention. He could see that people were eager to hear what would happen next, how they could turn their shared commitment into actual help for children who needed medical care. "Before anyone leaves tonight," Alexander said, "I want to make sure we have a clear plan for moving forward. Alina and I will not let this energy and dedication go to waste." Alina stepped forward, pulling out her phone in a gesture that surprised many of the formal guests. Royal protocol usually kept technology hidden during official events, but this was no longer a typical royal gala. This had become a working meeting to save children's lives. "Dr. Williams," Alina said, "you mentioned 3 hospitals within 50 miles that could benefit from expansion. Can you give us their names right now so we can start making contact with them tomorrow morning?" Dr. Williams was impressed by the princess's direct approach. She pulled out a small notebook from her evening bag and flipped through a few pages. "Riverside Children's Hospital has excellent cardiac specialists, but their equipment is 15 years old," Dr. Williams said. "They have a waiting list of 3 months for heart procedures for children like Marcus." Marcus's father leaned forward in his seat, listening intently. The idea that his son might be able to receive better care closer to home was almost too good to believe. "St. Catherine's Medical Center has a wonderful oncology team," Dr. Williams continued, "but they only have 12 beds in their children's cancer ward. They turn away to patients for everyone they can accept." Sophie's mother felt her heart race as she heard this. St. Catherine's was only 30 minutes from their home, compared to the 2-hour drive they had been making to St. Mary's Hospital. "And Children's Hope Hospital has some of the best pediatric neurologists in the country," Dr. Williams concluded, "but their imaging equipment is so outdated that they have to send children to other hospitals for basic scans." Emma's parents exchanged a meaningful look. Emma needed regular brain scans to monitor her recovery from surgery, and the delays in getting appointments had been a constant source of stress for their family. Alexander was taking notes on the back of the envelope that had brought such devastating news just an hour earlier. He was transforming the paper that had announced failure into a document that could help plan success. "Elena," Alexander said, "can you contact our scheduling office tonight and arrange visits to all 3 hospitals within the next 2 weeks?" Elena was already typing on her phone, sending messages to their private secretary. "I'm also asking them to prepare briefing documents about each hospital's current capacity, funding needs, and expansion possibilities." A well-dressed woman in the middle of the room stood up. She was Margaret Thompson, one of the evening's largest donors and the owner of a successful construction company. "Your Royal Highnesses," Margaret said, "my company has experience building medical facilities. If you need cost estimates for expanding these hospitals, I can have my team provide detailed assessments at no charge." Alexander looked at Margaret with gratitude. "That would be incredibly helpful. We need to know exactly how much good we can do with the funds we have raised." Alina smiled at Margaret's offer. "We also need to make sure that any construction work can be completed quickly. These children can't wait years for the help they need." An older gentleman near the back of the room raised his hand. He was Dr. Robert Chen, a retired hospital administrator who had volunteered with the Royal Foundation for several years. "Prince Alexander, Princess Elena," Dr. Chen said, "I spent 30 years managing hospital expansions and renovations. The key to success will be focusing on projects that can be completed in 6 to 12 months rather than trying to build entirely new wings." Dr. Williams nodded in agreement. "Dr. Chen is absolutely right. Adding equipment and renovating existing space is much faster than new construction, and it can often help more patients more quickly." Alexander could see that they were surrounded by people with exactly the expertise they needed to make this new plan work. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of helping multiple hospitals, he was beginning to feel confident that they had the right team to make it happen. Sophie raised her hand again, and Alexander immediately recognized her. The brave little girl had become the unofficial voice of all the children who would benefit from their efforts. "Prince Alexander," Sophie said, "will we be able to visit the new places where children get help? I would like to see what you and Princess Elena are building for us." Elena knelt down beside Sophie's wheelchair, bringing herself to the child's eye level, just as Alexander had done earlier. "Sophie," Elena said, "not only will you be able to visit, but we want you and other children and families to help us make decisions about what each hospital needs most." This suggestion caused a buzz of excitement throughout the room. Parents began talking quietly among themselves, discussing what improvements would make the biggest difference for their children's care. Marcus's father stood up again. "Your Royal Highness, that is a wonderful idea. We parents know what makes hospital stays easier or harder for our children. We notice things that doctors and administrators might not think about." Emma's mother added, "Simple things like having comfortable chairs for parents who need to stay overnight, or having play areas where healthy siblings can wait during long appointments. These details matter so much to families." Alexander was impressed by how quickly the parents were thinking about practical improvements that would help other families. Their experiences had given them insights that could make the foundation's work more effective. "We will create family advisory committees at each hospital," Elena announced. "Parents and older children will work directly with hospital staff and our foundation to plan improvements." Dr. Williams looked excited about this approach. "Including families in the planning process will ensure that the money is spent on things that truly make a difference for patients and their loved ones." Alexander looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of everyone who had committed to this new direction. The evening had started with devastating news that could have ended their charitable efforts entirely. Instead, it was ending with a more ambitious plan that could help more children than they had ever imagined possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said, "when we started this evening, we thought we were here to celebrate building one new wing at one hospital. Now we are planning to improve children's health care across an entire region." Elena stood up and moved to stand beside her husband again. "This is what happens when good people refuse to give up in the face of disappointment. You have all proven tonight that setbacks can become opportunities if we face them together." The room filled with applause again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just appreciation for the royal couple's leadership. It was the sound of people celebrating their own collective decision to turn a crisis into a chance to help even more children than they had originally planned. 6 months later, Prince Alexander stood in the newly expanded cardiac unit at Riverside Children's Hospital, watching as 10-year-old Marcus walked slowly down the hallway with his parents. The boy's steps were steady and strong, so different from the careful, cautious way he had moved before his successful heart surgery 3 weeks earlier. The new equipment that the Royal Foundation had helped purchase had made Marcus's procedure possible without the long waiting list that families used to face. Princess Elena was in the next room, sitting beside Sophie's hospital bed as the 8-year-old girl received her treatment through the advanced chemotherapy system that had been installed at St. Catherine's Medical Center. Sophie's mother sat on the other side of the bed, no longer stressed about long drives to distant hospitals. The treatment Sophie needed was now available just 30 minutes from their home, and the new pediatric oncology ward had bright, cheerful rooms designed with input from families who understood what children needed during difficult medical treatments. The transformation had happened faster than anyone had expected. Margaret Thompson's construction company had worked around the clock to complete renovations at all 3 hospitals. Dr. Chen had coordinated the projects with remarkable efficiency, ensuring that each hospital received exactly what it needed. Most Dr. Williams had helped train medical staff to use the new equipment and had even recruited additional pediatric specialists to work at the expanded facilities. Alexander walked through the hallways of Riverside Children's Hospital, remembering the night 6 months ago when everything had seemed hopeless. The letter announcing St. Mary's Hospital closure had felt like the end of their efforts to help sick children. Instead, it had become the beginning of something much more meaningful and far-reaching. Alina joined Alexander in the hallway, having finished her visit with Sophie. The little girl was responding well to her treatment and had even started growing back some of her hair. More importantly, Sophie's spirits were high because she was receiving care close to home, surrounded by family and friends who could visit regularly. "Marcus looks wonderful," Alina said to Alexander as they watched the boy and his parents disappear around a corner. "His father told me that the doctors say his heart function has improved dramatically since the surgery." Alexander smiled, remembering how worried Marcus's parents had been about the long waiting lists at other hospitals. The new cardiac unit at Riverside had eliminated those delays, and children with heart conditions could now receive prompt treatment that often made the difference between life and death. They walked together toward the new wing that housed the hospital's expanded imaging center. Emma was scheduled to have her regular brain scan there that afternoon, and her parents had mentioned how much easier it was to get appointments now that the hospital had modern equipment and additional staff. As they walked, Alexander and Elena were joined by Dr. Williams, who had become the unofficial coordinator of medical services across all 3 hospitals that the Foundation was supporting. "Your Royal Highnesses," Dr. Williams said, "I have some wonderful news to share with you. The improvements at these 3 hospitals have created a model that other regions want to copy. We have received requests from hospital administrators in Scotland, Wales, and Northern England asking for guidance on how to create similar networks of coordinated care." Alina felt a thrill of excitement at this news. The idea that their approach could help children across the entire kingdom was more than she had dared to hope for. "That means the impact of what we started here could reach hundreds more children," Alexander said, his voice filled with the same amazement he had felt throughout this entire journey. Dr. Williams nodded enthusiastically. "The government's health ministry has also taken notice. They are considering providing additional funding to support similar projects in areas that need better pediatric care." As they continued walking through the hospital, they encountered Emma's parents in the waiting area outside the imaging center. Emma herself was inside having her scan, but her mother and father looked relaxed and confident in a way they never had during the stressful days of traveling to distant hospitals and waiting weeks for appointments. "Princess Elena, Prince Alexander," Emma's father said, standing up to greet them, "we cannot thank you enough for what you have made possible here. Emma's scan today will give us results within an hour instead of the days we used to wait. The doctors can monitor her recovery much more closely now," Emma's mother added. "But it's not just the medical improvements. The whole experience is less. It's frightening for Emma because she knows she's close to home. She sleeps in her own bed the night before appointments instead of in hotel rooms, far from everything familiar." Alina felt tears of joy forming in her eyes as she listened to Emma's mother describe how the changes had affected their family's daily life. This was exactly what they had hoped to achieve, making medical care less stressful and more accessible for children and their families. Alexander looked around the busy hospital corridors, watching medical staff who were able to help more children. Because of the expanded facilities and new equipment, nurses moved efficiently between rooms that were designed with families in mind. Doctors had access to technology that helped them provide better diagnoses and treatments, and most importantly, children were receiving care without the delays and travel difficulties that had once made their medical journeys even more challenging. Margaret Thompson appeared around a corner, wearing a hard hat and carrying blueprints under her arm. Her construction company had just finished the final phase of improvements at Children's Hope Hospital, and she was conducting a final inspection to ensure everything met the highest standards. "Your Royal Highnesses," Margaret said, "I have just come from Children's Hope Hospital, and the new neurological wing is complete. The first patients will be admitted tomorrow, and the medical staff is thrilled with how everything turned out." Alexander and Alina exchanged a look of deep satisfaction. The 3rd hospital in their network was now fully operational, completing the vision that had emerged from that emotional night 6 months ago. Dr. Chen joined their group, carrying a folder full of reports and statistics that documented the impact of their work. "I have been tracking the results across all 3 hospitals," Dr. Chen said, "and the numbers are remarkable. We are now treating 60% more children than was possible before the improvements. Wait times have been reduced from months, 2 days for most procedures, and patient satisfaction scores have increased dramatically because families can stay closer to home." Alina looked at the folder of data that Dr. Chen was carrying, but she was more interested in the individual stories. Behind those numbers, each statistic represented a child like Sophie or Marcus or Emma, whose life had been made better by the network of care they had created. Alexander thought about the night when everything had seemed to fall apart, when the closure of St. Mary's Hospital had felt like a devastating failure. The tears he had shed in front of all those people had been real, born from genuine heartbreak over children who needed help. But those tears had also marked the beginning of something more powerful than anything they had originally planned. Sophie appeared at the end of the hallway, walking slowly but steadily toward their group. Her treatment was finished for the day, and her mother was beside her, carrying the colorful hat that Sophie no longer needed to wear because her hair had grown back thick and healthy. "Prince Alexander, Princess Alina," Sophie called out, her voice strong and clear. "I wanted to thank you for keeping your promise. You said you would find a way to make things better, and you did." Alexander knelt down to Sophie's level one final time, just as he had done that emotional night when she had asked if they would find a way to help. But this time, instead of tears of sadness, his eyes filled with tears of joy and accomplishment. "Sophie," Alexander said, "you and all the other children taught us that sometimes the best solutions come from the worst problems. Thank you for believing in us even when we didn't know how we would keep our promise."